Okay, thank you. I'll just start out. I'm not actually a doctor yet, so I'm still a PhD student. But thank you for the introduction. So yes, I'm going to be talking to you a bit about bats today, and also community science, citizen science, as we've been hearing it referred to. I'm coming from the same sort of background. I'm not an educator. I am kind of more from a science background, so I'm trying to kind of tailor this towards education, which is not my main field. So please bear with me on that. So to start out, why am I talking about bats? Well, bats are actually really important ecologically. There's more than 1,400 species that have been described around the world. They very often cohabit with people, so they're really integrated into people's lives. So it's high diversity and living in close proximity to us. They're also very important in terms of the ecology at night. So they're flying around in the night skies. A lot of species are important predators of flying insects at night, which can be beneficial for people through controlling pest insects. So that could be from things like mosquitoes, biting insects. It can be pests that will feed on crops that people want to have. So beetles that are feeding on cotton are controlled by bats to a large extent. You have bat species that are very important for pollination. So bats that will feed at the flowers and then move on to the next flower and pollinate the plants. Again, this can be very beneficial for people because there are certain crops that are pollinated primarily or entirely by bats. For example, durian, very popular Southeast Asia, almost entirely pollinated by bats. They're also very important at night for seed dispersal. So a lot of forest trees rely on bats feeding on the fruits and then flying away from the tree, dispersing the seeds so that they can grow somewhere else. So they're really important species during the nighttime, but they're also very much under threat. So about a third of species have been listed by the IUCN Red List as being globally threatened or data deficient, which basically means we don't know enough about them, but most of those data deficient species are probably also threatened. They're threatened by habitat loss, either directly from building on habitats or indirectly from things like light pollution, which is one of the main focuses of my PhD. They're very often as well threatened by direct persecution. So that can be people either hunting them to eat or people also just killing bats. They have this bad reputation. People are often scared of them and just go out and kill bats for no reason. This has been particularly the case as well during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Once people understood that this was probably a virus that evolved originally in bats, people were going out and just randomly killing bats because they were scared that they might be carrying the disease. So because of this, as we've been hearing from various people today, one of the ways to protect a species like this is to increase public awareness, to increase empathy. So people are scared of bats. One of the ways to protect them is to get rid of that fear, to get people to actually understand how important they are, and to have a much more friendly feeling towards them. And so that's really going to be what I'm talking about today, and in particular using this species, the greater short-nosed fruit bat, as an example of how I think that we could reach out to the public to get them interested in bats and understanding about bat conservation. So quick breakdown of what I will be talking about. First of all, a bit of a background to the species, and then some discussion about research that has been carried out on the species in Hong Kong. And then I will be talking about this community science survey that we carried out back in 2021. So first of all, the species itself. So this is the great short-nosed fruit bat. Scientific name is Cynopterus sphinx. It's a very common species in Hong Kong. So you find it basically anywhere in Hong Kong. You could probably go outside on campus here, and it wouldn't surprise me if you can find them on campus here, everywhere in Hong Kong. And they're actually quite easy to find and to observe, which I think is very important for the public. You know, if you want to get people interested in bats and you say, oh, well, you've got to stay up until midnight and go out to this field somewhere in the New Territories, people don't want to engage with that. But this is a species that you can see during the daytime very easily, even in the middle of the city. And then also they kind of look cute. They've got the big friendly eyes, they've got this kind of really gentle expression, which again is very important for getting people involved and interested. A lot of people think that all bat species are ugly. I think that this kind of proves that they're not. Species bats are often very attractive. So the reason I say that this species is very easy to find and to observe is because they have a tendency to roost in these fan palm trees. Now, these are tree species that are very commonly planted in Hong Kong. So they'll be planted very often in urban parks, but also right into the middle of housing estates. You will see kind of just a small planter surrounded by buildings and have a group of fan palms growing in it. And the bats will use these even in housing estates, particularly the Chinese fan palm, the Livistona, but also the petticoat palm, which is Washingtonia, which is a much taller species, but not quite as commonly planted. And when they're using these, they create what are called tents in the leaves. So what happens is that the male will bite through the kind of solid veins that hold the leaf structure in place, and the tips of the leaf will just drop down vertically. And then if you stand underneath, you can look up and you can see the bats sheltering within that. So you can see here, kind of the male has bitten the semicircular area around the edge of the leaf, and then it drops down. You can see on the left there a group of bats sheltering in a tent underneath one of the leaves. So it gives them good protection from the environment, it gives them good protection from predators because they're out in the tips of the leaves, harder to catch by land predators. They also have quite an interesting social system. We heard earlier from Fiona and from Karina about kind of the idea that people will relate to something if it's got a similar, you know, if you can have, I think you called it one life, people can relate and understand animals. These you can watch them behaving in the wild. The roosts kind of act like a family. It's usually one male and a group of females. You can very often see the young as well. So young bats are we call pups. You can actually see perhaps not clear on here, but the second bat down on here is a female with a pup that she's basically holding against herself. And so you can watch their behavior. So in terms of finding the bats, I thought it might be useful to kind of discuss some ideas if people are interested to look at them. If any of you are educators and you want to kind of use this as a system, how do you find the bats? You often see the food that they're eating underneath the roosts, and from that you can actually look at what sort of food they're eating in the area. You can often look for the black droppings underneath the fan palms as well. And some advice, if you are going out trying to find bat roosts, it does take a bit of practice. It's not too difficult, but it takes a bit of practice to really get the hang of how to do this. So my advice based on past experience, I find it's easiest on a sunny day, and especially in the morning. So if the sun gets too high in the sky, you're looking almost directly at the sun. and it can be really difficult to count them. If you do it at kind of 9 o'clock in the morning, the sun is lower in the sky, they're easier to count. You often need to change the angle that you're looking at. So you're looking straight upwards, but often you need to kind of shift your way around the tree to make sure you're looking into all of the different leaves. Find the best angle to see that particular roost. Binoculars help if you have them. Some of the roosts are low down and you can see bats quite easily just with the naked eye. Some of them, especially in the petticoat palm, are high up. They can be difficult to count. And I also find that they can be quite hard to count in cold weather. So it's not that they're more difficult to see, it's just that they're harder to count. This is something that I'll come back to a little bit later in the talk. So that's introduced the species a bit. I was going to now talk about some of the research that has previously been done. So people have recognized that this is a species that you can study quite easily. So starting off with this survey that was carried out by AFCD, they carried out surveys between 2004 and 2005. The results of this were actually published in 2006. You can find this online at the AFCD website on their biodiversity newsletter. They, over the course of the year, they surveyed 3,000 fan palms in urban areas in Hong Kong. They found 177 roosts in those fan palms and a total of 819 fruit bats. And you can see from here that they are widespread across Hong Kong. So they're on Hong Kong Island, they're in Kowloon, they're in the new towns and the new territories. They're basically widespread in the urban areas. Following on from that, a few years ago, we had a student that came to work with us, or came on a master's course with us at Hong Kong University, who was very interested in bats. Her name, Ganishta Sivaran. She's actually from Mauritius. She's back in Mauritius now. But she did this very interesting study back in 2018, 2019, where she surveyed 10 of the urban parks every month to see how many bats there were in each of the parks. She was looking at what food was underneath the roost, so to get an idea of what different foods they were eating. She tried looking at whether there was any preference for certain fan palms over others. And she was looking at how much food was available over the course of the year. And that was really kind of where I started out studying this species. I was helping her with some of these surveys and planning the project. And then when she left Hong Kong, I thought, well, this is an interesting start. I want to continue doing some of this. I've continued in 5 of those urban parks, so just carried on the surveys that she was doing every month. Starting from August 2019, I actually haven't been out the last couple of months, I'm afraid. So effectively it's finished back in March. And again, recording the number of bats in each of the roosts and also recording the location of the roost each time. So some of the results that I've had from those surveys, this is just from 2019 onwards. You can see initially there was an increase in the population size. This was particularly noticeable as well in a couple of the parks, not so much in the others that seem to have been more stable over time. And then it's been stable since 2020. So I think that the reason for this, my best hypothesis for it at the moment, is that some of you may remember back in 2018, in September 2018, we were hit by a very big typhoon, Typhoon Mangkhut. And that would have been right at the breeding time for this species of bats. We know that a large number of trees fell down. We know that at least some of the bat roosts fell down during that storm. And I think we actually did have a population crash in the number of fruit bats at that time, particularly at some of these sites, which is why I'm seeing it more at a couple of sites than others. And they seem to have recovered in numbers, taken a couple of years to just pick the numbers back up, and now stabilized in terms of population. And then the other thing that I've noticed from my surveys is seasonal variation in roost size. You can see here on the graphs, I have a red line for the largest roost that I recorded in that month, which sometimes can go up to 30 bats. And then a roost size, the average roost size as well. And you can see that I'm getting peaks during the winter months, so particularly December, January, February. And this does seem to be related to the colder weather. Those are the months that it's colder in Hong Kong. And once I compared the roost sizes against the temperatures that have been at those sites during the previous few days, you found that when the temperature was lower, the bats were gathering together into larger roosts. And this is what I said earlier, that it can be difficult to count them in cold weather. They huddle together for warmth. And you can just get this ball of bats that is really difficult to count. And then I've also noticed that they change roost site quite often. So from month to month, I will find them in different trees. Some trees, of course, are preferred, but then other trees are used, just from time to time, or they will use a tree for a few months and then abandon. So the combination of these things made me start thinking, well, if we really want to understand the bat population in Hong Kong, it might be better to do kind of a snapshot survey. The previous survey we had from AFCD was over the course of a year. It didn't take into account the fact that the roosts are moving around. It didn't take into account the fact that the size of the roost was potentially changing over the course of that year. So I thought, well, it would be interesting to do a snapshot just at one point. How many bats can we find in Hong Kong? As one person, that's quite difficult to do, to cover all of Hong Kong in a short time period. And that is where citizen science, community science comes in. I thought, well, if I want to get good coverage, I need to get more people involved. And that would also then be an opportunity to start educating people, start getting people to understand the interest of this species, the value of bats. So I thought, well, I'll give this a try. I'll carry out a kind of an experimental survey, see how much interest we can get, see whether or not we can get good coverage. So to go about this, I initially invited people through a Facebook group that I cooperate with Karen, who's here today, and also approaching friends, colleagues, other people that I know in kind of green groups who were potentially interested, and asked them if they would be interested in carrying out surveys. I scheduled it so the surveys were carried out in February 2021. The reasons that I chose in February, as I mentioned, it's often a month that they're gathering together into larger roosts. I thought maybe that might make it easier for people to find the roosts than just if there's single bats around. It was also because of the weather. So typically at that time of year, we have nice weather. If you start scheduling it during June, July, then you've got very hot weather, you've got frequent rain, it can be very difficult to do surveys. Obviously, I wanted to avoid double counting. I wanted to get as much coverage as I could. So I asked people to actually contact me in advance to say, okay, I'm interested in doing this site, so that I could try and make sure that we didn't have lots of people going to the same site. if someone had already chosen that site, I could say, okay, well, perhaps, you might want to choose this other park nearby. And everyone then went out and recorded, firstly, the number of fan palms that they surveyed. Now, it was quite important that they recorded, they told me, even if they'd surveyed fan palms and hadn't found any bats, I still wanted that information because I wanted to know kind of where the bats weren't as well as where the bats were. And people also reported back on the size of each of the roosts that they found. So, quick summary of the results. We ended up with 40 people taking part, which allowed us to cover a total of 152 sites. This varied, some people just covering one site, some people covering multiple sites. We managed to cover or survey more than 7,000 fan palms, so I was actually very pleased with this. If you remember, the AFCD survey covered 3,000 over the course of a year. We were able to cover 7,000 just in 1 month, which shows the value of getting more people involved. 346 roosts and almost 1,500 bats. Again, I was very pleased with those totals. So a few maps to just kind of quickly give an overview of the results. This is the number of palms that people surveyed. You can see just quite widespread across Hong Kong, Hong Kong Island, Kowloon, New Territories, and Lantau and Lama. A couple of sites that people went to and didn't find fan palms, which are the red dots that you can see on here. And then the number of bats that people recorded at their site. One thing that I'm really interested in here is that you'll notice that there's a lot more of the red dots. So people surveyed the site and didn't find any bats. And that they seem to be particularly in eastern Hong Kong. So around Tai Po Sha Tin, eastern Kowloon, and also Hong Kong Island. The average number of bats per palm, I'm not sure that this map on its own shows you that much. Slightly higher numbers typically in the New Territories. And the number of bats per roost, again, this doesn't really tell you that much. It's fairly uniform across Hong Kong. So to summarize that regional variation, what's particularly relevant is the number of bats per palm. And what we found was that urban Kowloon and the New Territories were generally better for finding fruit bats. We found fewer bats on Hong Kong Island and on the outlying islands. But the roost sizes at each of these sites is fairly similar. So it seems to be just that the population size is lower in certain parts of Hong Kong. It would be an interesting research, I think, to try and understand why that is. I'm not sure of why. I suspect it's to do with temperature or weather, but not sure. I also broke it down in terms of the habitats that were being surveyed. Again, what's relevant is bats per palm. So the urban parks were particularly good. I think that this is because they tend to have a lot of fan palm trees and also a lot of fruit trees. So it's quite easy for the bats to find food and to find somewhere to sleep nearby. But we did still find actually quite good numbers of bats, even right into very developed areas. As I said, you can get housing estates just with a single fan palm, and you can sometimes find a roost of kind of 10, 15 bats in there, just in one palm. Again, though, number of bats per roost didn't really seem to be affected by different habitats. So a quick summary of that citizen science project. I thought overall we managed to get good coverage over a short period of time. I think that it might be useful to follow up in different years and perhaps different seasons. I was hoping to do that kind of following on, unfortunately, my PhD and COVID and various other considerations kind of interrupted that. I hope that we can get back to it at some point. I thought as well, because we're talking about education today, it might be useful to kind of share some lessons that I learned from planning this project, carrying out this project, in case anyone was interested in doing something similar in future. So first of all, I had a big difference in success between the observers. It was a bit unclear to what extent this was patchy distribution of bats, so certain sites having fewer bats than others. You saw that it was mostly in the eastern side we were getting 0 counts or lower counts. But also it was possible that there was a difference in experience between different observers. So someone who had not done a survey before perhaps didn't fully understand the best way of doing it, perhaps weren't looking in quite the right places, the right parts of the fan farm to try and find the bats. What I did find was this was leading to a bit of frustration with some people. Some people were emailing me to say, oh, I've searched 200 fan palms and I couldn't find any bats. And I just had to reply, look, I'm sorry, this is just the nature of ecology. You can't predict. But I think that in terms of if I was doing this again, it would be worth making sure that I was offering training to people in advance. So suggesting that people come out to join me doing a survey somewhere convenient beforehand, so that we could kind of say, okay, this is where you look for the bats, this is how you find them, you know, and an idea of how to count them and how to find them. The second lesson is the spatial distribution of observers. So most people, not surprisingly, most people are going to be based in urban areas. So that meant that we tended to get people wanting to survey in urban areas close to their house. There were certain sites in particular areas that several people approached me and said, can I survey this site? And I had to start saying, well, I'm sorry, someone else is already doing that. Victoria Park was the main one. I had like 4 or 5 different people approach me and say, I want to do Victoria Park. And I was having to suggest other areas to look. And then the other thing as well, I think there was a kind of a bias in terms of where people thought would be a good site. So we've seen that the urban parks actually were better, but I was wanting to try and make sure that we covered urban areas as well, so that we could do that comparison. And I think people were, because they don't expect to find bats in the middle of housing estates, they weren't suggesting housing estates as being their survey area. But in actual fact, some of them are very good. So, so in terms of in future, I think that maybe it would be better to kind of plan some sites in advance and say to people, okay, I know that there's lots of fan farms in this area. Could you survey this area for me? To try and make sure that we get good coverage across Hong Kong and across different habitats. And then I think that the other thing to try and learn from this is that it would be very useful if we were able to reach a larger audience. This time around, I was enrolling people largely through word of mouth. It would be good to try and involve more people. It'd be good to involve more of the local Cantonese speaking community. I'm not Cantonese, I don't speak Cantonese. And so I was struggling at times to actually reach out to the larger community to get people. So having a Cantonese speaker more involved at an earlier stage, I think would be beneficial. Potentially engaging with other media. So we did it mostly, as I said, through Facebook or word of mouth, but trying to reach out to people who perhaps were not already involved in that way. In particular, it would be useful, I think, in terms of raising awareness of bat conservation, to try and just reach out to the public. A lot of the people who were involved are people who are already in green groups, already somehow involved with conservation or animals. But trying to get involved with the public or perhaps with schools might be a good way to approach this. And then also more time. I left it a bit too late, I think, to try and recruit everyone. I gave myself about a month or so, and it was really kind of then just pestering people saying, can you let me know, can you do the surveys? So giving it more time, and also I think potentially repeat surveys, you can retain interest over time. So that's from me. Thank you, everyone. If there's any questions, then please ask.
Were you able to look at other species of bats while you're out there at the same time?
No, we didn't actually try that. So the reason that we're particularly looking at this species is that they're so easy to survey in the fan ponds. Other species of bats are roosting in
Caves, but there are
caves, buildings, kind of hollows in trees. They're difficult places to survey. These ones are easy because you can do it daytime. Anytime during the daytime, you can just go out and look up and you can see if the bats are there or not. If I was asking people to try and survey kind of holes in trees or in buildings, we don't know enough about where bats are roosting. The other alternative to survey other species of bats is to do it at night, but then you need specialist equipment. It's much more difficult to do. And in terms of engaging and interesting the public, I thought that this was a better approach to get people aware of bats and interested in bats and bat conservation.
In the scientific community, how well regarded is the veracity of that data?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I have not actually yet written it up for publication. Obviously, because it's using citizen science, there are a lot of caveats that you have to put in it. And particularly in terms of this issue that I was mentioning in terms of potentially observers being less experienced, which could affect some of your results. I think that it's actually relevant data. I think it is actually useful. But I think that you do have to understand and acknowledge that there are certain restrictions and certain caveats in terms of if you were using this for long-term study, which you may be able to research kind of some of those and understand what those limitations are, understand better how to control for those.
Are you planning to make this like a program, like keep recruiting people, engaging them, and keep surveying and extending the survey along Hong Kong?
Yeah, so that was my initial plan. So I did this kind of as a preliminary thing, and then I thought, well, it'd be good to follow it up, to do it either every year or perhaps even every 6 months. As I said, doing it during the summer is a bit more complex in terms of weather limitations. It also gets a little bit tricky if the bats have got pups and people who are less experienced, if you're having to ask them to judge if it's a young bat or an adult, adds another complication. So they're not breeding at that time of year. I was hoping to follow it up. Yeah, I just haven't had time to follow it up since then. Right.
Anyone else from the audience?
I just some quick questions. Do you think that there are other ways of projects to help, the population of Hong Kong, and also you concerned about, having more people go into survey class? Because of course the HD, the Hong Kong is going to concerned about that, and they've talked about that. So what do you think about?
So you think the health department will be concerned about people looking for bats?
Yeah. But, well, at least.
Potentially a bit, yes. And that actually, for me, that actually is one reason to carry out, to do something like this, to try and raise people's awareness and understanding of the fact that most of the time, this is not going to be an issue. You know, it's perfectly safe to stand underneath a bat roost and look at them. But one, you know, if there is an issue related to bats, if you do find a sick bat or something, then yes, there is potentially a risk involved there. Which again, just more education, more understanding from people. People have this association of bats with disease, which is not really very well deserved. Yes, we have had various diseases that have arrived from bats, but you know, as long as you manage for that appropriately, that shouldn't be a problem. COVID-19 has been a bit of an exception there.
Species seems to have come from only a couple of bat species.
That's right.
Related bat species. I guess they're not very dismissive.
They're not. So, I mean, we're still not sure which species it would have originated in. It seems to be a horseshoe bat, which are cave living species. This is a thing that people commonly misunderstand, that they think, oh, well, it evolved in a bat, therefore bats will be able to carry the disease. But they're not related. You know, these bats started evolving like 60 million years ago. They're in various very unrelated groups. It's like assuming that a disease carried by pigs is automatically going to be a problem for camels. You know, they're very unrelated species. And in actual fact, there has been research since COVID-19. The ethics is a bit questionable, but they actually tried infecting bats with COVID-19 to see whether or not they would be susceptible kind of catching it from people, basically. And the species that they were looking at in America, they were not able to infect the bats at all. So we know that it's not in all bats. It's only like 1 or 2 species that are going to be able to carry it.
So that's in there.
Like I say, the ethics I'm a bit hazy on, but
If there's no more questions, let's give another round of applause to it.